Why did his laugh sting more than the shrapnel still buried in her skin? The colonel's voice echoed across the office like steel against concrete, dismissive, sharp, unforgiving. To him, she was just another name in a file, a young sergeant requesting too much leave, a soldier who looked fine on the outside, who stood straight, spoke clearly, saluted without hesitation. What excuse could she possibly have? But Maya Rodriguez kept her shoulders squared, even as her stomach churned. She had rehearsed every possible answer, but no rehearsal ever prepares you for the weight of disbelief, especially when it comes from a man like Colonel David Mitchell, 34 years in uniform, silver hair, eyes like cold iron, a presence that silenced rooms before he even spoke. She had faced ambushes, explosions, and nights when silence was broken only by the sound of her own heartbeat in the dark. Yet this moment felt heavier, because this wasn't the enemy. This was her own chain of command. He leaned back, arms crossed. "Health issues," he repeated with a scoff. "At 26, you look fine to me." Maya swallowed the rising anger. Invisible wounds didn't wear a name tag. They didn't salute. They didn't line up neatly in medical charts. They throbbed in the dark, whispered during restless nights, twisted inside her when the fragments shifted against bone. But how could she explain that without sounding weak? Her voice came out steady, even though her pulse betrayed her. "Sir, my medical needs are documented. I'm not seeking favors. I'm only asking for what's necessary." The colonel's gray eyes narrowed. "Necessary," he echoed. "I've seen soldiers drag themselves back from war with missing limbs and burns covering half their bodies. They didn't ask for special treatment." His tone sharpened, cutting the air thinner. You stand here looking perfectly healthy. What am I supposed to believe?" It was the laugh that broke something inside her. That single, sharp sound, cruel in its dismissal. She had carried silence for years. Silence about the blast. Silence about the surgeries. Silence about the days she couldn't tell left from right when the world spun too fast. And now, she was expected to defend her pain as if it were on trial. Her hands trembled slightly, hidden behind her back. And yet inside something hardened. "Appearances can be deceiving, sir." The colonel smirked, leaning forward, elbows on his desk. "Then prove it. Enlighten me. What exactly is this mysterious condition you're hiding?" Maya's chest tightened. For months she had avoided this exact moment. The choice, to reveal or to conceal, to keep her scars beneath the fabric of discipline or to let them speak. The silence stretched between them like a rope pulled taut. Then she inhaled, slow, steady, final. Her hands moved to the collar of her uniform. The colonel frowned. "Sergeant, what are you doing?" Her voice did not waver. "You said you wanted the truth. You're about to see it." Button by button, she loosened the armor she wore daily. The pressed blouse that hid a battlefield more permanent than any deployment. And as the fabric parted, the colonel's eyes widened. Scars, twisted, raised, unrelenting. Each one a story carved into flesh by an IED blast in Helmand Province. 52 pieces of shrapnel, fragments of a single violent second that refused to leave her body, even after years of recovery. The room froze. The colonel's mouth opened, but no words came out. Maya stood tall, chest bared, not just of scars but of truth. 4 years ago, my convoy was hit while transporting comms equipment to a remote outpost. 3 soldiers didn't make it. I did, but I carry them with me here. She gestured to the jagged lines cutting across her skin. And I carry the fragments still inside me, every day, every breath. Her voice was calm, stripped of anger, stripped of the need to prove. It was fact, a fact that echoed louder than his laughter ever could. "When they shift," she continued, "I lose balance. I can't hear properly. Sometimes my vision tunnels. Those medical appointments you see in my file, they aren't favors. They are the only reason I can still stand in front of you." The colonel's shoulders stiffened. His authority shrank under the weight of her revelation. Maya buttoned her shirt again, not to hide but to reclaim. She had nothing to prove anymore. She had spoken, and her scars had spoken louder. The colonel turned to the window, his reflection staring back at him. For the first time in years, doubt cracked through the stone of his command. "Sergeant," his voice was thin, uncertain. "I didn't know." "No, sir," Maya replied softly. "You didn't, because I chose silence, because I didn't want pity, because serving with dignity meant more to me than explaining my pain." The room remained silent, save for the faint hum of fluorescent lights. And in that silence something shifted, not just in the colonel, in Maya too. She had spent years hiding, bracing against disbelief. But for the first time her scars had spoken, and the man who had laughed now looked at her with shame, with recognition, with the beginning of something she had thought impossible: respect. Yet deep inside, a question pulsed, a question that would linger long after she left that office. Would her truth change anything? Or was it just another scar the military would try to cover? The day outside was bright, too bright, the Tennessee sun catching on the razor wire that lined the fences of Fort Campbell. Soldiers marched, vehicles rumbled, the base moved on, oblivious to the quiet war fought in that single office. As Maya stepped out, her heart raced, not from fear but from release. For years she had carried silence. Now silence had been broken. But what she didn't know, what no one knew yet, was that her decision would ignite something far larger than her scars. Something that would ripple through commands, shift perceptions, and challenge an institution built on toughness to finally face what toughness really meant. Not the absence of pain, but the courage to live with it. And as she walked away from the colonel's office, one thought stayed with her, heavier than the fragments still inside her. Sometimes dignity doesn't roar. Sometimes it whispers beneath scars, in the space between silence and survival. Why didn't he say anything? The silence stretched in that office longer than any speech, longer than any reprimand. Colonel Mitchell stood by the window, rigid shoulders no longer symbols of authority but of shame. His reflection stared back at him, a man forced to see what he had mocked just minutes before. Maya adjusted her blouse, her fingers steady despite the storm inside her. She hadn't planned to show him. She hadn't planned to expose the battlefield carved into her skin. But when his laugh cut through her, when his disbelief threatened to erase the sacrifices of 3 men who hadn't made it home, something in her broke. Or maybe it finally healed. The colonel cleared his throat. "Sergeant, why didn't you?" "Because it wasn't your business, sir," Maya cut in, her tone sharp but not disrespectful. "Because my duty doesn't require me to justify the pain I carry, and because silence felt easier than the ridicule I face today." The words landed harder than any salute. Mitchell's jaw tightened. For a moment Maya thought he might lash out, reclaim his authority with anger, but his gray eyes softened just barely. He lowered himself back into his chair, the leather creaking beneath his weight. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly, "a profound one." Maya kept her gaze forward. She didn't need his apology. She needed his understanding. She needed him to see that her scars weren't excuses, they were endurance. That night, lying in her barracks, sleep didn't come. Every time she closed her eyes, the colonel's laugh returned. Every time she shifted, the familiar ache in her ribs reminded her of the shrapnel that refused to leave. She pressed her palm to her chest, feeling the rough lines beneath the fabric. They weren't shame anymore, but they weren't freedom either. Was she reckless to reveal them? Would word spread? Would whispers follow her through the mess hall, through the motor pool, through the ranks she had fought so hard to earn respect in? Or could this moment be something else? The next morning, whispers did follow, but not the kind she expected. "Did you hear? The colonel sat with the medical staff for hours yesterday. He was asking questions about brain injuries, PTSD, even hearing loss. No one ever seen him in the clinic like that before." Maya overheard fragments in the hallway, soldiers speaking in hushed tones, their disbelief laced with curiosity. Something had shifted in him. something she hadn't anticipated. Later, Dr. Martinez, the base's chief medical officer, stopped Maya during a routine check. "Whatever you did in that office, it mattered," she said softly. "He came down last night, asked me to explain invisible injuries, to walk him through cases, yours included. He took notes like a cadet preparing for inspection." Maya blinked. "He asked about me." Dr. Martinez nodded. "Not to expose you, to understand you." The words unsettled Maya. She hadn't wanted to be anyone's example. She hadn't asked for her pain to become a teaching tool. But maybe, just maybe, silence breaking meant more than she thought. Days turned into weeks, and slowly the colonel's change spread like ripples in water. He ordered new training sessions for officers, mandatory briefings on recognizing and respecting invisible wounds. Maya was called in to share her story, reluctantly at first, then with growing resolve. The first time she stood at the front of the classroom, a sea of uniforms staring back, her throat nearly closed. Her scars burned under her blouse, as if they knew they were about to be unveiled again, not physically this time, but through words. "Why didn't you tell us sooner?" someone asked afterward. Her answer was quiet, but it filled the room. "Because I thought silence was strength. I was wrong." The responses surprised her. Commanders approached with gratitude. NCOs confessed they had dismissed soldiers who might have been suffering. A young captain admitted he'd been losing his hearing for years but hid it, afraid to look weak. And for the first time since Helmand, Maya didn't feel alone. But with every story shared, every confession drawn out by her example, the weight pressed heavier on her chest. Being strong for herself was one battle. Being strong for others, that was another war entirely. Late one evening, after another draining session, she sat outside the barracks, the Tennessee air thick with humidity, cicadas buzzing like distant machinery. A private approached, barely out of his teens, face pale, eyes haunted. "Sergeant Rodriguez," he asked, voice trembling. I was in a convoy that hit an IED last year. I didn't get hurt, not physically, but since then I can't sleep. I hear the blast every night. I thought if I told anyone they'd think I was weak." Maya looked at him, saw herself in his fear. She didn't give him a lecture, she didn't give him statistics, she gave him silence first. Then honesty. Invisible doesn't mean imaginary. You're not weak. You're human. And humans break differently. But breaking doesn't mean you can't keep going. The boy's eyes watered. He nodded, whispered thank you, and walked away with shoulders just a little less heavy. Maya leaned back against the bench, exhaling. She hadn't asked for this role, but maybe this was why she survived that day in Helmand. Not to carry scars in silence, but to remind others that silence was never the only option. Inside his office, Colonel Mitchell sat with a stack of reports he would have once dismissed. He read them slowly now, carefully, like each word carried weight. He remembered the laugh he once threw at her and hated it. He remembered the scars she revealed and carried them with him. The man who once mocked invisible wounds now fought for them. And Maya, the woman who once hid her truth, now carried it like a banner she never wanted, but one she refused to drop. Still, in the quiet moments, doubt lingered. Could change last? Or was this just a brief awakening in a system too large, too rigid, too proud? The scars beneath her uniform didn't answer. They only ached, as they always did. But maybe that ache was the reminder she needed that some battles aren't fought with rifles or orders. Some battles are fought with truth, with silence breaking, with one voice refusing to be laughed away. And in that truth, she began to see a different kind of strength, not the kind written in medals or measured in missions, but the kind carried in scars, visible and invisible, the kind that whispered and still was heard. Why did applause feel heavier than silence? The training room buzzed with polite claps as Maya stepped back from the podium, her palms damp, her chest aching beneath her uniform. Faces blurred together, captains, majors, sergeants first class, all staring at her not with disbelief, not with mockery, but with something far worse to carry: admiration. She had spoken for 20 minutes, her voice steady but her heart unraveling with every word. She had told them about Helmand Province, about the explosion that ripped through her convoy, about waking up in a military hospital with metal still lodged inside her, and about the long days she chose silence rather than explanation. She had expected indifference. She had braced for skepticism. But the tears glinting in a female commander's eyes, the tight nod of a major who clenched his jaw as if hiding his own confession, those cut deeper than the colonel's laugh ever had. Afterward, officers approached her one by one. Words like thank you and brave poured out, and she forced herself to smile, to nod, to absorb them like they mattered. But inside, something twisted. She hadn't shared her scars to be brave. She had shared them because she had been cornered, because silence had finally become heavier than exposure. And now she was trapped in a new silence, the weight of being their example. That night she sat alone in the barracks, the overhead lights long switched off, the base settling into its nighttime rhythm. Through the window she saw the glow of distant headlights as vehicles rolled back in. The ache in her ribs throbbed, a dull reminder of what still lived inside her. She pressed her palm against the fabric, closing her eyes. Her scars were no longer just hers. Across the base in his office, Colonel Mitchell stayed late. Reports and memos covered his desk, not the usual logistics and readiness numbers, but pages of research, studies on traumatic brain injuries, PTSD, chronic pain, hearing loss. He read until his eyes blurred, trying to catch up on all the years he had spent dismissing what he could not see. He paused, rubbing his temples. The memory of Maya's scars, vivid, raw, undeniable, haunted him. It wasn't just the flesh he remembered. It was the silence she broke. The way her voice didn't ask for pity, only recognition. And for the first time in decades, Mitchell admitted to himself that command wasn't about being unyielding. Sometimes command was about listening. The next morning, Maya's schedule listed another mandatory training session. She considered excusing herself, claiming fatigue or headaches. But when she arrived at the classroom, soldiers filled every seat, not just officers now, but enlisted men and women, privates barely out of basic, staff sergeants with deployment stripes running down their sleeves, all waiting, all listening. Maya gripped the edge of the podium, steadying herself. She hated the spotlight, but as she scanned the room, she noticed the nervous tapping of one private's foot, the clenched fists of a corporal who wouldn't meet her gaze, and she realized they weren't here to see her. They were here to hear themselves in her story. So she told it again. Not the way it lived in medical reports, not the way doctors described the fragments lodged inside her. She told it the way it felt, the ringing in her ears when silence should have been peace. The flash of panic when headlights at night looked too much like the flare of detonation. The guilt that 3 men hadn't come home while she still breathed. She spoke softly, paused often, let silence fill the spaces her words couldn't reach. And when she finished, no one clapped, not at first. They just sat in it, the weight of truth that demanded listening, not applause. Later in the hallway, a young corporal caught up with her. His eyes were glassy, voice tight. "Sergeant, I think I need help." 3 hours later, Dr. Martinez told her the corporal had scheduled his first appointment. Maya sat outside the clinic afterward, sunlight warm on her shoulders, but inside she felt cold. With every soldier who stepped forward because of her, her responsibility grew heavier. She hadn't signed up to be anyone's savior. She just wanted to do her job, carry her pain, serve with dignity. Now she was carrying theirs too. Was that strength, or was it another weight threatening to break her? Meanwhile, Colonel Mitchell changed in quiet ways that startled the entire base. He walked through the medical facility not with suspicion but with patience. He asked doctors to explain scans, therapies, medications. He stopped reprimanding soldiers for medical absences. And more than once, Maya saw him pause in the hallway, nodding respectfully at those he would once have dismissed. Some soldiers called it a miracle, others called it guilt. Maya wasn't sure which was true, maybe both. One evening, Mitchell called her into his office again, but this time the air was different. No papers scattered across his desk like evidence. No narrowed eyes ready to accuse. Just a man, older than she'd ever seen him, shoulders bowed under something invisible of his own. "Sergeant," he began, then stopped, searching for words. "Do you know why I laughed that day?" Maya tensed, the memory of it still burned. "Because you didn't believe me, sir." He shook his head slowly. "No, because I didn't believe myself. I didn't believe that someone like you could endure what I could not imagine. Laughter was easier than facing what I didn't understand." His honesty startled her. For a moment she saw not the colonel who had dismissed her, but the man beneath the rank, flawed, uncertain, trying. "I was wrong," he said firmly, "and I intend to spend whatever years I have left in this uniform proving it." Maya didn't reply. She didn't need to. The silence between them was enough. In the weeks that followed, something unexpected happened. Soldiers stopped whispering about the colonel's laugh. They started talking about his change, about the new briefings, about the way he listened, about the sergeant who had shown him what invisible wounds really looked like. Maya hated hearing her name in those conversations, yet she couldn't deny the shift. Soldiers who once skipped medical appointments now walked into the clinic with heads held a little higher. Others who had hidden their nightmares now sat in counseling rooms, finally unburdening themselves. Her scars hadn't just spoken, they had started an echo. But in quiet moments, doubt still gnawed at her. She would sit on her bunk at night, tracing the rough patterns on her chest, whispering to herself, "This is not who I am. This is not all I am." Because she feared something deeply, that the army, that her peers, that even she herself would see only the scars now. Not the soldier, not the communicator, not the woman who still dreamed of leading, of building, of something beyond surviving. And in that fear, another question haunted her. Could she carry her scars without letting them define her? What if telling the truth meant losing yourself to it? The Pentagon didn't call her name directly, not at first. It came as a request buried in orders. Sergeant Rodriguez, report to Conference Hall 3, guest speaker at Officer Development Seminar. She stared at the paper, her stomach tightening, guest speaker. The words felt foreign, almost absurd. She had joined the army to communicate on the battlefield, to keep lines open under fire, not to stand behind podiums, barring scars she never wanted to make public. But orders were orders. She arrived in her pressed uniform, the weight of medals she rarely thought about clinking softly as she adjusted them. The hall was filled with officers, majors, lieutenant colonels, even a general in the front row. Their eyes followed her as she walked to the stage. For a heartbeat, Maya thought about staying silent. She thought about standing there, letting the quiet stretch until it swallowed the room. But then she saw them, not the ranks, not the polished brass, but the people. The tired lines around a major's eyes. The way a captain rubbed his temple as if fighting a headache he'd never admit to. The way a young lieutenant fidgeted, like he wanted to be anywhere but here. So she began. Not with the explosion, not with the scars. She began with the laugh. The colonel's laugh that dismissed her pain, that forced her silence to break. And she watched as their faces shifted. The general in the front row leaned forward. The captain stopped rubbing his temple. The young lieutenant froze in stillness. By the time she described the IED blast, the room was silent. Her voice cracked only once when she spoke of the 3 soldiers who hadn't survived. She let the pause linger there, long, raw, unforgiving. Some wiped their eyes. Some looked down at their boots. When she finished, no one moved. No one clapped. And in that stillness, Maya realized something terrifying. They weren't looking at her as a soldier anymore. They were looking at her as a mirror. Later, a general approached her, his handshake firm, his voice low. "Sergeant, what you shared today, it's going to change how we lead. Thank you." She smiled politely, but inside the words felt like another weight pressing on her chest. Change. Responsibility. She hadn't asked for it, yet now it followed her, uniform to uniform, office to office. Back at Fort Campbell, the changes deepened. Mandatory training sessions became permanent. Soldiers who once avoided medical care now lined up at the clinic. Even senior NCOs, the ones who had scoffed for years, began to speak differently. Colonel Mitchell noticed it too. One evening he stopped her in the hallway. "You realize what you've started, Sergeant?" he asked. His tone was not accusatory but reverent. Maya shrugged, weary. "I didn't start anything, sir. I just stopped hiding." He gave a small nod. "Sometimes that's all it takes." But that night, as she sat on her bunk, her hand pressed against her ribs, the doubt returned. Was it enough? Or was she just another story the Army would eventually file away, like so many reports gathering dust? The following week, the colonel invited her to sit in on a new policy meeting. For the first time, soldiers with chronic pain, TBI, PTSD were not whispered about, they were spoken for. Maya listened quietly as doctors, officers, and even junior enlisted described their struggles. She expected pushback. Instead, she saw something remarkable: understanding. And still, she felt uneasy. Because every time someone looked at her, she saw the weight of their expectation. She wasn't just Maya anymore. She was the soldier with scars, the woman who spoke truth to command, the proof that invisible wounds were real. She wanted to ask, what about the rest of me? The girl who loved music before the war, the sister who sent postcards home with little sketches of desert sunsets, the soldier who dreamed of leadership not because of scars but because of strength. But she kept that silence inside. Weeks later, at another seminar, a captain approached her after she spoke. His voice cracked as he admitted, "I've been losing my hearing for years. I thought if I said anything, they'd bench me. Listening to you, I realized I need to stop pretending." She nodded, encouraged him, smiled. But when he left, she leaned against the wall, her legs trembling. Every confession she drew out felt like another brick stacked on her shoulders. That night she dreamed of the explosion again. Not the fire, not the screams, but the silence after. The kind of silence that felt endless, suffocating. She woke drenched in sweat, clutching her chest, whispering their names, the three who hadn't made it. The next morning she reported to duty as always. Uniform crisp, salute sharp. No one saw the nightmares. No one saw the shaking hands she pressed into fists. Because leadership, she reminded herself, wasn't about what you carried. It was about how well you hid it. Still, she couldn't ignore what was happening. Soldiers were coming forward. Command was listening. Policies were shifting. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the fatigue and the fear, hope flickered. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the base, Colonel Mitchell found her again. His silver hair caught the last light, his face older than she remembered. "Sergeant," he said quietly, "I've recommended you for officer candidate school." Maya froze. "Sir, I don't." "You've already been leading," he interrupted. "Not with rank, with truth. And truth is the rarest kind of leadership we have." Her throat tightened. She thought of the scars beneath her uniform, of the fragments still shifting inside her. Could someone like her really be more than just a symbol? Could she command, not because of wounds, but because of strength? That night, lying in bed, she whispered the question into the dark. Am I strong enough to lead, or just strong enough to survive? The silence didn't answer, but for the first time it didn't feel suffocating. It felt like possibility. Why did leadership feel lonelier than silence? The gates of officer candidate school loomed ahead, not as iron bars but as unspoken judgment. Maya tightened her grip on the strap of her duffel bag. The weight of her gear, nothing compared to the weight of expectation pressing down on her chest. She was no longer just Sergeant Rodriguez. Not here. Not in this place where names were stripped down, where rank meant nothing, and where every candidate started at the bottom of a new ladder. Here, she was simply candidate. Yet the whispers followed. "That's her," someone muttered during orientation. "The one from Fort Campbell, the scar story. She's the reason Mitchell changed the training program." Another added, low enough to think she couldn't hear. "I heard she almost died from an IED. Still got metal in her." Maya kept her eyes forward, her face unreadable. She had learned long ago that silence was both shield and weapon, but inside her stomach turned. Was this who she would always be to them? Not a soldier, not a leader, but a story. Days blurred into drills, lectures, endless evaluations. OCS was built to break you down, then build you into something sharper, harder, ready to command. Physical tests were brutal, but Maya met them with grit. Long ruck marches strained her lungs, the fragments in her chest sending dull throbs of pain with every mile. She refused to fall behind. At night, when the barracks were dark and quiet, she lay awake listening to the restless breathing of others. Candidates whispered about family, about fear of failure, about dreams of pinning on bars. Maya whispered nothing. Her scars throbbed beneath her uniform, constant reminders that her body had already been broken and rebuilt once before. She couldn't afford to break again. But leadership was not measured in rucksacks or push-ups. It was measured in eyes, in trust, and that was where Maya felt herself falter. During one field exercise, her squad hesitated at a river crossing. The plan was simple: rig a rope, get across, maintain formation. But when voices rose in confusion, eyes turned to her. She froze, not from lack of knowledge, but from the sudden realization that they were waiting for her. Not because of rank, not because of orders, but because of the reputation that followed her. "Rodriguez," one candidate called. "What's the call?" Her mouth went dry. For a moment she wasn't standing at a river, she was back in Helmand, dust choking the air, radio crackling, the convoy waiting for her signal before they rolled forward into the unknown. And then the blast. Always the blast. "Rodriguez," another shouted. She snapped back, blinking, forcing her voice steady. "Anchor the rope upstream, pair off, keep spacing, move now." They obeyed, the squad crossed, and when it was done, someone muttered, "See, told you she knows what she's doing." But as they moved on, Maya's hands trembled. Leadership wasn't just about giving orders. It was about carrying the weight of what came after, and she knew that weight too well. Weeks passed. Some candidates thrived. Others faltered and were quietly sent home. Maya endured, her body screaming through pain she refused to name, her mind haunted by memories she refused to voice. One evening, as the candidates cleaned gear after a grueling day, a woman named Carter sat beside her. Carter was sharp-eyed, confident, the kind who spoke her mind without hesitation. She leaned closer, her voice low. "Why do you hide it?" Maya stiffened. "Hide what?" "The scars, the story. Everyone knows who you are, but you act like it doesn't exist." Maya's jaw tightened. "Because it doesn't define me." Carter studied her, unflinching. "Maybe. Or maybe it does, just not the way you think. Maybe it proves you've already been tested in ways the rest of us can't imagine." Maya didn't respond. She didn't want to be tested anymore. She just wanted to lead, not as a survivor, not as a symbol, but as herself. The final field exercise came under gray skies, rain soaking the ground, mud clinging to boots. Maya's squad was tasked with a night assault, simulated but brutal in its demands. Halfway through, one candidate panicked, freezing in the dark as flares lit the sky. The squad risked failure. Maya didn't think, she moved. She crouched beside him, voice low but firm. "Breathe, you're not alone, look at me, one step at a time." He shook, eyes wide, breaths ragged. She guided him forward, steady, calm, carrying his fear without judgment. The squad completed the mission. Later, the instructors pulled her aside. "You kept your squad together tonight," one said. "That's leadership." But Maya didn't feel proud. She felt heavy. Because when she saw that candidate freeze, she saw herself, the silence after the blast, the panic no one else could understand. She had steadied him, but who would steady her? Graduation day came with ceremony and crisp uniforms. Maya stood in formation, shoulders squared, as her name was called. Second Lieutenant Rodriguez. The bars pinned on her collar gleamed in the morning light. Applause filled the air. She saluted, her face a mask of discipline. Inside, she felt two things at once, pride and fear. Because with the bars came expectation. With the bars came visibility. She was no longer just the soldier with scars. She was an officer now, and every soldier under her command would look to her for strength she wasn't sure she had. That night, alone in her new quarters, she removed her uniform jacket and touched the scars beneath. She whispered into the empty room, "Am I leading because of my wounds or in spite of them?" The silence gave no answer, but in the quiet ache of her chest, she felt a strange truth. Maybe leadership wasn't about having answers. Maybe it was about carrying questions and still moving forward. Why did the bars on her collar feel heavier than body armor? The first morning she reported as Second Lieutenant Rodriguez, the salute came sharp, crisp, but the eyes behind it carried something different. Her soldiers knew her story. Whispers of scars and shrapnel had traveled faster than orders. Some looked at her with awe, some with skepticism. All of them looked. She returned the salute, jaw tight. In that moment she understood. Leadership wasn't just about giving commands. It was about carrying the gaze of every soldier who measured her not by her title, but by whether she deserved it. Her first platoon was a mix of fresh privates and seasoned specialists, men and women with their own scars, some visible, most not. She walked the line during formation, her boots crunching against gravel, her voice steady as she introduced herself. "I am not here to be your friend," she said. "I am here to be your leader. And leadership means one thing, responsibility, for you, for the mission, for the things we carry, even the things no one else can see." The words echoed louder in her own chest than they did in theirs. The weeks ahead tested her in ways OCS never had. Paperwork stacked high. Training schedules clashed with personal crises. Soldiers arrived late, sick, distracted, sometimes broken in ways no regulation covered. One afternoon, a specialist missed formation. When she tracked him down, she found him in the barracks, pale, trembling, his hands shaking so badly he couldn't lace his boots. "I'm fine, ma'am," he muttered, "just didn't sleep." She recognized the look in his eyes, the same haunted distance she had seen in her own reflection years earlier. "No," she said softly, kneeling beside him. "You're not fine, and you don't have to be." He broke then, tears falling, words spilling about nightmares from deployment, about explosions that replayed in his mind every night. Maya didn't lecture, she didn't dismiss. She sat with him in the silence between sobs, then walked him to the clinic herself. Later, when paperwork demanded she mark him unfit for duty that day, she hesitated. The Army valued readiness. But what did readiness mean if soldiers carried wounds no one acknowledged? She signed the form anyway, her signature both a shield and a promise. That night she sat at her desk long after lights out, staring at the bars on her collar. Command wasn't about shining medals or polished briefings. It was about choices like this, small, invisible, but heavy. Choices that carried lives. Colonel Mitchell called her weeks later, his voice gruffer than usual but tinged with pride. "I've been hearing about your platoon, Lieutenant. Word is your soldiers trust you." "Trust is fragile, sir," Maya replied. "Easier to lose than to earn." He chuckled, but it wasn't the dismissive laugh she remembered. "You'll learn that command isn't about being perfect. It's about being present." She hung up, staring out her window at the base lights twinkling in the distance. Present, she could do that. She had to. But presence meant more than just showing up. It meant carrying their fears, their doubts, their invisible battles alongside her own. And some nights, that weight pressed so hard she could barely breathe. One evening, after a brutal training exercise, her platoon gathered in the mess hall. Laughter rose, trays clattered, the smell of overcooked pasta filled the air. Maya sat at the edge, observing more than eating. A private approached, hesitant. "Ma'am, can I ask you something?" She nodded. "Is it true that you still have shrapnel in you?" The room went quieter, ears straining though no one looked directly at her. Maya set down her fork. "Yes, it's true." "Does it still hurt?" She didn't answer right away. Pain was complicated. Sometimes sharp, sometimes dull, always present. "Yes," she said finally, "but it reminds me I'm alive, and it reminds me why I lead." The private nodded slowly, then returned to his seat. The whispers resumed, softer this time, not gossip, but something like respect. Later, alone in her quarters, Maya touched the scars on her chest, her fingers tracing the rough lines in the dark. She whispered to herself, "They see the scars, but do they see me?" The silence gave no answer. Weeks bled into months. Her platoon passed inspections, completed exercises, endured long nights and early mornings. But beneath the rhythm of military life, a quiet revolution brewed. Soldiers began speaking up more about headaches that wouldn't fade, about panic attacks after night training, about hearing loss from too many gun ranges. And every time they did, Maya listened. She didn't fix everything. She couldn't, but she made sure they knew they weren't invisible. One night during a storm that rattled the windows and soaked the parade field, she sat at her desk, exhaustion pulling at her bones. She pulled out an old photo, her convoy before Helmand. 3 men grinning, dust caked on their faces, life in their eyes. She ran her finger over their smiles. "I hope I'm doing this right," she whispered. The thunder outside swallowed her words. But in her heart, she carried their silence as both question and answer. Because maybe leadership wasn't about never breaking. Maybe it was about breaking and still choosing to stand. And as lightning split the sky, she felt it, the weight of her scars, the weight of her soldiers, the weight of command. Heavy, endless, necessary. Why did success feel so much like exposure? 2 years had passed since Maya first walked into Colonel Mitchell's office, her silence shattered by his laugh. 2 years since her scars stopped being secrets and started being symbols. And now, standing in the polished marble halls of the Pentagon, she felt smaller than she ever had in Helmand Province. The conference room was filled with stars, not the kind in the sky but on uniforms. Generals, admirals, senior civilians from the Department of Defense. The air was thick with authority, with expectation, with history itself. Maya adjusted her dress uniform, her fingers brushing against the faint outlines of scars beneath. They were hidden from view but never truly hidden. She felt them in every heartbeat, every breath. And now she would speak with them once more. The program had been named without her, the Invisible Wounds Initiative. Born from a conversation in a colonel's office, grown through training sessions, whispered stories and soldiers who dared to speak, it had now reached the highest levels of command. Maya stepped to the podium. Her voice did not tremble. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her words deliberate, her cadence steady. "When we started this program at Fort Campbell, we had one simple goal: to create an environment where soldiers felt safe seeking the medical care they needed." She paused, scanning the room. The silence was absolute. No one checked watches. No one shuffled papers. "Today," she continued, "I am proud to report that we achieved that goal and more. Soldiers who once hid their pain are now seeking help. Leaders who once dismissed invisible wounds are now listening, and the army is stronger for it." Her throat tightened, not from nerves, from memory. "I know this because I lived it. 4 years ago, an IED left 52 pieces of shrapnel in my body. Some were removed, some remain. They move sometimes, they ache. They remind me daily of what was lost and of what survived." She exhaled, steady. "For years I kept that silent. I thought strength meant hiding pain. I was wrong. True strength is in acknowledgement, in facing the wounds that no one can see." When she finished, the applause was restrained, not because it lacked power but because it carried weight. Generals nodded, admirals whispered to aides, and Maya realized something terrifying. They were listening. Afterward, senior officials approached, hands outstretched, words of praise heavy in the air. You've given this initiative life. Your courage is an example to all. The services will follow your lead. Maya smiled, thanked them, shook hands. But inside, doubt gnawed. Was she leading or was she being used? Was her story a weapon for change or just another tale to polish speeches and line policy binders? That night back in her hotel room, she removed her jacket, sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her hand to her chest. The scars throbbed under her palm. She whispered to them, "Am I still a soldier or just a story now?" The silence gave no answer. Back at Fort Campbell, her soldiers treated her differently too. With pride, yes, with respect, but also with distance. She was no longer just Lieutenant Rodriguez. She was the lieutenant who spoke at the Pentagon. They carried her name like a banner, but banners weren't always bridges. One evening, Specialist Hayes knocked on her office door. His eyes were downcast, his posture tense. "Ma'am, I wanted to say thank you." "For what?" "For everything, for being honest, for making it easier to come forward. I've been in counseling, nightmares, the blast from my last deployment. I wouldn't have gone if not for you." Maya's chest tightened. "I'm glad you did, Specialist." He hesitated, then asked, "But does it ever get easier carrying it?" She wanted to say yes. She wanted to tell him healing was linear, that strength was permanent. Instead, she told him the truth. "No, it doesn't get easier, but it gets lighter when you stop carrying it alone." He nodded, eyes wet, then left quietly. Maya sat back in her chair, exhausted. The truth was heavier than comfort, but it was all she had. Weeks later, Colonel Mitchell visited her platoon. His hair was grayer, his steps slower, but his eyes carried something new, humility. He pulled Maya aside. "You've done what I never could, Lieutenant," he said. "You've made the Army listen." Maya shook her head. "I just stopped being silent, sir." He smiled faintly. "That's leadership." But that night, as she lay awake, she wondered if it was. Leadership to her still felt like stumbling through fog, carrying not only her scars but the shadows of everyone else. At a follow-up briefing in Washington, she listened as generals debated policy language, funding allocations, implementation timelines. Acronyms filled the air. PowerPoints glowed with charts and bullet points. Maya sat quietly at the edge of the room, her scars burning beneath her blouse. These men and women could change the Army with signatures, with orders. But would they? Or would her story fade into the archives, filed away like so many forgotten reports? A general turned to her suddenly. "Lieutenant Rodriguez, would you care to share your perspective?" She rose slowly, steadying her breath. "Sir, policies don't change cultures, people do. Soldiers don't need another memo. They need leaders who listen. They need proof that invisible wounds don't make them weak, they make them human." The room stilled. For a moment Maya wondered if she had gone too far. Then the general nodded. "Noted." As she sat back down, her chest ached, but not from the scars. From the weight of being the only voice in a room that could alter lives. Later, walking alone down the vast Pentagon corridors, her footsteps echoing against marble, she thought of the 3 soldiers who never came home from Helmand. She touched the scars over her heart, whispering their names. "Am I doing this for them or for me?" The silence, as always, offered no reply. But as she stepped outside into the cold Washington air, she realized something. Silence no longer consumed her. It accompanied her. It walked with her. And maybe that was enough. Because sometimes leadership wasn't about answers, or applause, or even change you could measure. Sometimes leadership was about carrying the question forward until someone else found the courage to answer. And Maya Rodriguez, soldier, officer, scarred survivor, kept walking. Her silence not weakness but proof that some battles are fought not with bullets, but with presence. Why did endings feel so much like beginnings? The Pentagon conference room was filled again, but this time it was different. Maya stood not as a junior officer on the edge of power, but as someone who had helped shape it. Beside her, Colonel Mitchell sat with quiet pride. In front of them, rows of senior officials waited, pens ready, screens glowing with drafts of policies that carried her fingerprints. 2 years of work had come to this moment. The Invisible Wounds Initiative was no longer a pilot program at one base. It was set to be adopted across the Army, with the Navy and Air Force watching closely. Soldiers across the country, across deployments, across silence, would finally be told what Maya had needed to hear years ago. Your pain is not weakness. She adjusted her uniform, the new silver bars of a first lieutenant catching the fluorescent light. Her scars ached faintly beneath the fabric, as they always did. But this time, she welcomed the ache. It reminded her of what had been endured to arrive here. When her name was called, she stepped forward. Her speech was short, not dramatic, not cinematic, just honest. Ladies and gentlemen, soldiers do not break in obvious ways. Sometimes they break in silence. Sometimes they carry wounds you will never see. But strength is not the absence of pain. It is the choice to stand anyway. This program does not erase wounds. It acknowledges them. And that acknowledgement may save lives. She paused, letting the words breathe. That's all I ever wanted. When she finished, the room erupted in applause, the kind that echoed down corridors and lingered in the air. But Maya didn't smile. She simply nodded, then stepped back. Applause was never the goal. After the session, General Hayes approached her. Lieutenant Rodriguez, what you've done here will ripple for decades. Soldiers you'll never meet will benefit because you chose to speak. Maya inclined her head respectfully. But inside, she thought of the soldiers she had met, the private who whispered about nightmares, the specialist who confessed to hearing loss, the corporal who froze during training. Their faces mattered more than applause. That night back in her quarters, she opened a small box she kept tucked away. Inside were 3 photographs, the men lost in Helmand. Their smiles, frozen in time, looked back at her. She whispered their names as she had done countless nights. "This is for you," she said softly. "I carried the silence because you could not. Now others won't have to." Her voice broke, but she did not cry. She had shed enough tears in the years since. What remained was resolve. Weeks later, she returned to Fort Campbell. The base looked the same, soldiers marching, trucks rumbling, the Tennessee sun glinting off chain-link fences. But something intangible had shifted. Soldiers walked into the clinic without hesitation. Commanders asked questions instead of dismissing. Silence was no longer the rule. Maya visited her old platoon. They greeted her not with whispers, not with stares, but with genuine respect. One private, braver than the rest, asked quietly, "Ma'am, do you ever regret showing them?" Her hand drifted unconsciously to her chest. "No," she said after a long pause, "because silence doesn't heal, it only hides, and hiding was never strength." That evening, as the sun set, Colonel Mitchell found her by the parade field. His silver hair caught the orange light, his face lined but peaceful. "You changed me," he said simply. Maya shook her head. "No, sir, you changed yourself. You chose to listen." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Then maybe we both learned something." They stood together in silence, watching the horizon burn with the colors of dusk. For Maya, it was not triumph. It was not victory. It was something quieter, something heavier, but purer. She knew the scars would never fade. The fragments in her body would always shift, always ache, always remind her. But they no longer felt like burdens. They felt like anchors. Anchors tying her to every soldier who ever carried invisible wounds in silence. Anchors grounding her in the truth she had fought so hard to uncover. That strength was not the absence of pain. It was the dignity of carrying it, quietly, steadily, without demand for recognition. Months later, in another conference room, another base, another audience, Maya found herself telling her story again. She no longer feared the whispers. She no longer resisted the symbol she had become. She spoke not for herself, but for those who could not. And when the speech ended, when applause filled the air once more, she looked out at the faces before her and thought of the 3 soldiers who weren't there to hear it. Their silence was still with her, but it was no longer crushing, it was guiding. As she left the stage, one line echoed in her mind, a truth she had lived, a truth she carried, a truth she finally understood. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.